The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
In 1835, the United States Army arrived in Florida with the intent of removing the Seminole people from the state and relocating them west. The Seminole were prepared to defend themselves using guerrilla warfare tactics and were never defeated. Less than 3,000 Native Americans successfully fought more than 30,000 U.S. troops. Unlike the Seminole, who were accustomed to the sometimes harsh conditions of Florida's swamps and thick pine forests, many soldiers were not prepared for the often oppressive heat and sometimes relentless rain of the Florida Territory. During the Second Seminole War of the 1830s, the United States Army built a series of forts around the state about a day's walk apart. The idea was that soldiers could walk from one fort to another during the day and have someplace safe to sleep and store their provisions at night. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. Fort Christmas was constructed on December 25, 1837.
Well, in 1830, the government passed the Indian Removal Act, which basically said we're going to have all Native Americans living east of the Mississippi sent west, primarily to what was then called Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. The Seminole were part of that. The idea was to somehow get them to agree to travel out west and take up new homes in what's now Oklahoma.
The United States military was trying a three-prong attack against, or campaign against the Seminoles. They had a group going down the west coast, one going down the east coast, and one kind of going down the center, and they hoped to just kind of east and west would move against each other, and the center would, pack them in. They're building the forts a day's march apart along the St. Johns River, thinking they can use the St. Johns River as a supply route, just run everything up and down the river. They started construction of the forts a little too soon. St. John's proved to be navigable much further south than we expected. And then they decided it's just easier to supply along the coast.
They built it in 2 days, according to the log. There were a lot of men, and it was a full company of men that came through. And they were building a line of supply forts along the St. Johns River. So they'd go about a day's travel apart by the wagons and everything they had with them, stop and build a depot. They didn't always call them forts. Then they'd go another day's travel, build another one. And so this was Fort Christmas.
The Seminole, they had this whole peninsula to themselves. They knew it, the back of their hand. This was their homeland. Whites at the time, they knew the coastal area. They knew hardly anything about the interior. There's a map from 1839, that government map, that doesn't show Lake Okeechobee. So this was new territory, and the Seminole knew where to hide. They knew how to travel through it. The government, of course, with their big columns of soldiers, weren't really equipped for that.
Historians have labeled the conflicts between the U.S. Army and the Seminole people that took place in the 1800s the First, Second, and Third Seminole Wars. What's commonly called the First Seminole War began in 1817 when General Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida and attacked Seminole towns near Tallahassee. In 1830, then U.S. President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which required that the Seminole be relocated to Oklahoma. When many refused to leave Florida, what's known as the Second Seminole War began in 1835 and lasted until 1842.
At the end of the Second War, there were maybe 300-400 Seminole still hiding out in the Everglades, but the government decided they weren't worth chasing at the time. So they said, you can live down southwest Florida as long as you don't bother anybody. But of course, whites kept moving south, and developers or plantation owners wanted that southern portion. They thought they'd have big sugar plantations or cotton plantations, rice, whatever, but they wanted to move down there. So the pressure just increased for the remaining Seminoles to join their brethren out there in Oklahoma. And the pressure got to the point where the Seminole finally said, no, we're not going to. They attacked the Army Survey Party, and that was basically the beginning of the Third War. Lasted a couple of years till about half of them under Chief Billy Bowlegs surrendered and went out west and left the remaining maybe 200 in Florida.
The Third Seminole War lasted from 1855 to 1858. From the Seminole perspective, what are called the First, Second, and Third Seminole Wars are one continuous conflict.
It was one continuous war. And really, it wasn't a war. To us, it's genocide. And it's a continuing story about the genocide of people being removed, people being killed off because they're different. And that, one group thinks that they have no right to be here, and the other group saying, hey, we're humans, and this is our historical homes, and there was no other place for them to go. So if you want to call it a war, but to us, it was survival.
Seminole War, especially the Second Seminole War, was really this nation's first guerrilla war that they had to fight, and really didn't know how to do it. The soldiers from West Point, they trained in European, Napoleonic battle tactics. You line up, face your enemy, and you shoot each other, see who can kill most of the other side. The Seminole didn't fight like that. They ambushed, they hid out, they retreated when they were charged because they didn't have an endless supply of new recruits. They had to back off and stay alive to fight the next time.
Military outposts around the state, including Fort Christmas, provided some protection for soldiers and a defensive retreat if the Seminole attacked.
We know what our fort looked like. It was built of pine pickets, 80 feet square with 2 blockhouses, 20 foot square each. The blockhouses were lookout posts. The officers could stay in here if they wanted. And then we have a storehouse, which is where they would have kept supplies. Yeah. And then we have a powder magazine that's kind of buried in the ground in case there was a spark that would cause an explosion. The energy from the blast would go up rather than out, blowing the fort apart.
So this is the storehouse that we're in, and this is where they stored all of their supplies. The blockhouses were used as officer sleeping quarters, and basically the soldiers camped outside in tents outside the area. They cleared about 100 yards completely around the outside of the fort, and they'd pitch the tents out there. They were attacked, they could run inside.
A replica of Fort Christmas was built about 2 miles from its original site in what is now Fort Christmas Historical Park.
The replica was built as a bicentennial project. We were celebrating 200 years of independence. And in 1976, we were doing everything historic, people getting in wagon trains going out. Jay Blanchard, who's head of Parks and Recreation at the time, loved forts. Whenever he traveled, he visited forts. So he talks everybody into reconstructing Fort Christmas. By recreating the fort, we were able to talk about a very important part of Florida history and actually a very important part of American history.
When I was a child, that was back in the 50s, early 50s, the part was donated or sold, I don't remember, I believe part of it, the original part was the Chenoweths. They had an orange grove next door here, and all the part where the main office is now, is that used to be Orange Grove and the tennis courts. And over behind us here where the Pioneer Village is, that used to belong to the Barber Farms Incorporated back in the 40s and 50s. And they had Orange Grove there as well.
The park originally was the picnic grounds for the community, and a lot of the families would come here and celebrate all of their family milestones, birthdays, family reunions, things like that. And then they built the fort later on as a bicentennial project, and from there it's just grown, and it's a huge part of our community. We have community events, family reunions, birthday parties. A lot of the Pioneer families still come and celebrate things here and reminisce and everything.
Our family is in part of this out here as well, and we have some of our ancestors' memorabilia, along with Osceola, some of his stuff. And when they actually found a dugout canoe in the river that's here now as well.
Here in Blockhouse 1, we have mostly our Seminole Indian War history. Downstairs is more based on the war itself, and up here we have a lot of the Seminole memorabilia and history and everything. The storehouse, of course, has like a tool display in it of stuff that they would have used back in that day to help build the structures and everything. Blockhouse 2 is going to hold all of our pioneer history. A lot of the cattle ranching and citrus industry stuff, and as well as all of our family genealogies and things like that.
My favorite of all in this fort is over there in the first storehouse, where it has all the accoutrements and the things that the soldiers would have carried. There's a musket ball that has teeth marks in it, and it's sliced, where a soldier had sliced it, because they built the fort on a creek. He sliced the musket ball so that he could put it on the line of his little fishing pole he had created, and he used his teeth to bite it together, so you can see the teeth marks in it. And that's my favorite thing in the fort.
We were in Blockhouse 1, and Blockhouse 1 is the Second Seminole Indian War. Upstairs, we're moving towards mostly Seminole. Then downstairs, there'll be more the soldiers. When they started this fort, there was our fort and Fort Foster. So we have a lot of really nice artifacts because we were one of the few places to put the artifacts. The second blockhouse, Blockhouse 2, has our pioneer items. Essentially, this fort, although it's a replica, is air conditioned and climate controlled, so it's a good place for our delicate artifacts. We have a lot of artifacts out on the historic site, but those, because they're exposed to heat and sun and all that, will slowly deteriorate. So we're a little careful about what we put where. And then the storehouse, which is where they would have stored things, we used, we have a tool exhibit in there and transportation.
We tried to keep the fort, most of the buildings reflecting what the soldiers would have had. And then we had one of the blockhouses, we had pioneer artifacts in, and those things were donated by members of the families who settled in this area. And this was all going on back in the late 1970s, that they were collecting things that were significant to the older families that lived here. And we did a lot of genealogies and, you know, actually could tell a little bit of a story about the people who lived here.
Many Florida cities grew up around forts that were built during the Second Seminole War. For example, Orlando grew up around Fort Gatlin. Tampa was the site of Fort Brooke. Fort Mellon was located at present-day Sanford. Many Florida cities retain their Seminole War fort names, such as Fort Pierce, Fort Lauderdale, and Fort Myers. The town of Christmas dropped the fort from their name, but pioneer settlers kept the name Christmas.
The Second Seminole War was when Florida gets explored. A lot of bodies of water. Lake Eustis up in northern Florida there, that was discovered when an army was crossing from the St. Johns River toward the west. They come across all these lakes. General Eustis was the man in charge. Lake Poinsett, Joel Poinsett was Secretary of War. Of course, Lake Jackson, Andrew Jackson's the president. A lot of other little places are named either for forts or they started as forts. Tampa started as Fort Brooke. Ocala started as Fort King. Miami was Fort Dallas. So this is when Florida starts to get really settled and really explored.
We are pioneer families back in the 1800s. Before they built the fort. And this is a replica here. But however, during those times, I asked my dad how we got here, and he says they carved a path because there was no highways. They'd take a little bit every day, and they were fleeing up in Alabama, Georgia, because they were part of the Indian family. And so they migrated down to this area here and settled.
My grandfather was part of the Hodges family. They were one of the original pioneer families. They settled in the late 1890s, early 1900s. We actually still own the family homestead over off of Taylor Creek where they grew up and everything. It's been in the family for, I think this is the 6th or 7th generation.
It was a difficult existence, and many of the Crackers were subsistence farmers. They raised hogs. Later, they were cattle farmers, cattle ranchers. But what really describes the Cracker culture, which it is, it's a culture. It's, you know, we started to inventory all the cultural attributes and the traits that made Crackers and figured out that it was in fact a group of people. But they had the ability to settle and subsist in very, very challenging areas.
Interesting enough, my great-grandfather, he was Irishman, had married Missouri, which was Chief Osceola's sister, and he fought with the Indians against the settlers that were coming in, the federal government, and so he took position with the Indians, and they rest in Pontiac today, but the rest of the family had migrated down during that time. Of course, Osceola ended up in South Carolina at the fort.
They figured out how to subsist very much like the Native Americans did. The Native Americans developed settlement patterns based on the resources that were available to them, generally food. And that includes the estuary resources, shellfish and fish. There were a lot of Crackers that survived that way. But in the interior areas, they grew their own food. They made their own products. They built their own houses, they made their own clothes. So they were self-reliant, self-sufficient. And that attribute in particular describes the core of the Cracker culture.
As a child growing up, I got to visit with a lot of those folks because they were born in the 1800s. And when I was born in the 50s, they were still in age and they lived a long time. And so I got to sit on the front porch while my dad took care of their properties. We grew up in the cattle and citrus industry. And so they had the equipment and the knowledge. They helped these families. And I get to sit on the porch and talk with them.
There are quite a few of the original families still here in the community. The Clarks, the Yateses, our family, the Partons, the Tanners. A lot of those families still come back to the park and have their family reunions every year and everything, and it's really cool to see them come back and reminisce and everything.
We still have some remnants that are still here, the Parton family. There was, of course, as they married, the names changed along the way. And so those, especially the Tanner family, were here as well. And several others, like Reddits. It just goes on and on and on.
From what I've been told early on, community was very important to the area. You had to rely on your neighbors for a lot of things because they didn't have, the luxury of just running into town to get something or, having a lot of that stuff on hand. So your community was your family. You had to, if you grew citrus and your neighbor, had cattle, then you would trade and barter with them to get what your family needed to survive.
We used to have a post office. We have one of the old buildings they're working on today. But the original was down the road here about a mile or so out east of us. And it was a general store as well, kind of like for dry goods. And they built the church, which I'm a member of, Pine Grove Baptist Church, in 1868. And the building that's there today is the third building, which is 1905. And that community, they gathered every Sunday, and they'd have a a preacher come in, a circuit preacher, and once a month. And so they'd have big family gatherings and serve the Lord.
Over the years, pioneer homes and other structures, including a school, were relocated to Fort Christmas Historical Park. Museum exhibits displayed inside the Fort Christmas replica and in the pioneer homes and buildings of the park commemorate the area's first settlers and their families.
I was here almost 25 years, and at the time I came on board, it was 1990, and at that point we just had the fort. It was a recreational park and the fort. I just started, we were all wearing all the hats. It seemed like we had a supervisor, but everybody else that worked, we just all worked together and did things together. My main duties to start with was working with the school groups that would come through, and of course helping to get the museum reassembled because we had been closed down for 18 months. So that's what it was to begin with. And through the years, it just kept growing and growing, and we moved all these houses on board, and the job was the curator of the collection. So that's what my duties were. But then I still worked with the children and the programs, and we all continued to work finely together.
We have 10 historic structures on display here. The oldest is 1870s, all the way to 1953. We're actually adding an 11th structure, the post office. It was Mrs. Tucker's, which was built in 1937. And it's the first building in Christmas to be purposely built as a post office. But we have mostly pioneer homes. We have a school and the lunchroom for the school, and the Beehead Ranch House, which is really the central building on the ranch. It wasn't really a private residence.
The original Cracker architecture, in fact, we're sitting in a house now that largely would describe what that Cracker architecture is. It's very basic, and it was designed primarily to keep the Cracker occupants cool in the summertime. They weren't terribly worried about the winter time, although they had to seal up the houses to stay warm. But it was really the harsh Florida heat that they had to combat. So there were certain architectural traits, certain architectural features that were built into the houses. There were always open and paired windows for cross ventilation. The roofs were steeply pitched to get the ventilation going that way, so the hot air was way up above them. The houses were elevated on piers, so you had any cool breeze blowing under the house that would keep the floor and the occupants above that. And they would even cool the middle of the house by building breezeways, or what the Crackers called dog trots for a reason, because that's how the dogs came through the house when they weren't supposed to. But a breezeway was a part of the house that essentially separated a very hot kitchen from the rest of the house where folks were living.
We picked the houses because of the different, to show the different time periods. Our smallest houses are one room. The Yates house was essentially started out as one room. They put a kitchen addition on 1923. The dog trot house, a little bit larger, nicer, but the family was in Citrus and could afford more. And then you get to something like Beehead, which is one of our largest structures, but it was built by a company. Tosahatchee, a group of men from Orlando, invested in the cattle and formed a company out here.
Unfortunately, these types of houses and outbuildings that we used to see in the rural Florida landscape are rapidly disappearing as civilization, the long arm of civilization is reaching into these areas.
We have a changing dynamics with people discovering our park and coming out here. And it's kind of fun because they come out here for a picnic, or they come out here, or a family reunion, and they have no connection to the Christmas community. But they come out here and they say, well, I wonder what that fort thing is. Let's go look at it. Let's go look at the historic site. And so we're kind of like a spider web. We trap people in and get them to look at history. That's kind of fun.
Fort Christmas Historical Park is located at 1300 Fort Christmas Road, which intersects State Road 50 about halfway between East Orlando and Titusville. The park is open 7 days a week, except for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida through the Division of Arts and Culture and the National Endowment for the Arts.